Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Workers' Party of Britain meeting with George Galloway on the question of Scotland and independence. Good evening, George. Good evening, George. Oh, we appear to be having some technical difficulties. Please stand by.
Nice graphic. Only 4 of us. What's wrong? Is Rob speaking? Microphone. Hello, hello, can everyone hear me? You can
Hi,
hear me?
George, we've got you now. Fantastic.
Excellent.
So
I just can't hear you.
that's a shame. We'll try and figure that out later.
I mean, I can speak and but I won't be able to take any questions this way because I can't hear anyone else.
Oh, good evening,
There
everyone.
we go. Yes.
Oh, do we have audio, George?
Excellent, excellent. Now, who's cheering? Dan or Rob?
I'll be taking over for the Q&A.
Okay, Rob, thanks. And thanks, Dan. Thanks, all of you. And as Dominic Cummings said yesterday, I'm sorry I'm late. But I mean it, he didn't. And I'm only a few minutes late because of that technical difficulty. Please forgive me nonetheless. And welcome to those who are not party members and are watching on YouTube, on Twitter, on Facebook. Very healthy audience last week, I must say. And let's hope, though we probably won't get quite the numbers this week, that this is healthy too. And that at the end of it, you decide you want to join us on the platform of Zoom because you decide you're going to join the Workers' Party of Britain. The subject, as you know, is Scotland, about which I am, I think, quite qualified to speak. I was born there in the Irish quarter of the city of Dundee in the summer of 1954, and I lived there for 30 years until I moved to London. And then in 1987, I was elected as a Scottish Labour Member of Parliament in the days when such a thing was possible, and in the days when the Scottish Labour Party was discernibly, even if faintly, a Labour Party. And I would have continued as a Scottish Member of Parliament, but Tony Blair expelled me from the Labour Party, and his Boundaries Commission abolished my constituency just in case anything might go right. And so, of course, I still have my family, my mother, my sister, my brother, all living in Scotland. I'm there often, and I keep, as you would expect, a very close eye on Scottish political developments. I'm going to talk, obviously, about the national question, because that has dominated Scottish politics for, honestly, far, far too long. I spoke at the Labour Party conference in 1974, when, that's the Scottish conference in Aberdeen, when Labour changed its previous opposition to a Scottish Parliament. I was one of those campaigning for that change. And so from 1974 until now, 2020, the national question has been the predominant question in Scottish politics. And therefore, the granting of Home Rule, the establishment of a Scottish Parliament, which was supposed to allow the Scottish people to move on beyond constitutional issues onto the vitally important social and economic civil society issues that ought to dominate the Scottish political landscape, has actually never happened. And the reason for that is the existence of the Scottish National Party, the governing party in Scotland, albeit with a minority in the Scottish Parliament, but with the support of the Scottish Greens, they continue to rule. There will be elections to the Scottish Parliament next year, and the Workers' Party intends to contest those elections. But I want to start, if you like, on the theoretical level. Is Scotland a nation, or has, as a result of more than 300 years of union between Scotland and England, has Britain become a nation instead? And does that supersede therefore the national rights of the Scottish people? Well, we stick to our historic definition of a nation, which is this: a nation is an historically constituted community of people with a common language, a common culture, common economic interests, and here's the rub, a common perception of themselves as a nation. Now, for me, Britain as a nation meets all of the tests except the last one. There is nobody in Scotland who doesn't think of themselves first and foremost as Scottish. Even I, as internationalist, a person as you could possibly meet, and who has spent most of his time since 1983 in England, would never answer in the positive a question which somehow missed the fact that I was Scottish. And so I think we need to approach this issue from the standpoint that we accept that Scotland meets all the tests of our schema for the definition of nationhood, and therefore Scotland is a nation, and therefore it has national rights. And amongst those national rights are the inalienable right of self-determination, to decide for themselves which relationship they wish to have with other nations, and in this case, principally the rest of the UK. If Scotland has that national right of self-determination, And if it had been denied, then I would be right now in the hills with my claymore, fighting against that denial of our national rights. But of course, that's not true. In fact, for almost 100 years, Scotland has been free to choose at any general election to opt to leave the union that we call the United Kingdom. The franchise, of course, at the very beginning was restricted, but the full franchise of every man and woman having a vote from 1929 is fast approaching. It will soon be 100 years in which the Scots have had that option to self-determine to leave the rest of Britain. And they have, until now, always declined to do so. They declined to do so for a wide variety of reasons, which I'll touch on in the course of my address. It may be that the day will come when the Scottish people will decide to self-determine as a separate country and leave the rest of Britain. And if the SNP have anything to do with it, they'll then jump into a much larger and much less democratic union called the European Union, another subject to which I shall return. But if we deal with the theoretical point, is Scotland a nation? Therefore, does it have the right to national self-determination? The answer, in my view, to those two questions is yes. And it follows that if the Scottish people decided to separate from the rest of Britain, that this must be accepted and their wish must be granted. That would place some of us in a difficult position. I'd have to up sticks and move back and practice my politics there because my country had decided that it wished to stand alone. But I believe, and I was right last time, in the referendum of 2014, I predicted to the percentage point that the Scots would reject what they call independence by 55 to 45. I did it live on BBC on Andrew Neil's television show. And I did that because obviously I know the Scottish people well, I know the politics of Scotland well, but I was also a partisan in that campaign. Some are kind enough to say that I, for one man, made an impact on that campaign, particularly amongst Labour voters, people who were on the verge of decamping from the Labour camp to the Nationalist camp. And I predict, and here you'll want to write this down, and I predict that if there was another referendum on Scottish independence, that the separatists would lose it again, and this time by a larger number. Because the case for separatism is as weak today, and it will be no stronger next year or the year after that, than it has been for the best part of a century. That which was a massive leap in the dark under Alex Salmond in 2014 is now actually not a leap in the dark at all. With its imperfect light, 2020 vision, you can see what the major obstacles to independence being a good thing for the Scottish people are there. And again, as I say, I'll come back to them. But on the theoretical level, Scotland has the right to choose to be independent. And if it does, that independence must be granted. But is it a good idea? Well, I have fought against it all of my life, since I was 13 years old. And so when people ask me or slander me as some kind of traitor for opposing Scottish independence, I really wonder how that thought process even works. Why would I support Scottish separatism now when I have opposed it all my life? And when the reasons for opposing it all my life have not changed. And here they are. Because I'm a socialist and because the Workers' Party is a socialist party, we believe that the most important identity, not the only identity, but the most important identity is class. And the class interests of the Scottish working class are not served by separating from the English and Welsh working class people. On the contrary, the interests of the Scottish working class are weakened, and they would leave weaker the interests of the English and Welsh working class. So why would someone like me support that? And then there's the question of competing identities. I've got many, as I've often spoken about, even many national identities. I regard myself as British and Scottish, but mainly Irish, if you want the truth. But there are other identities, of course, also. Your color, your religion, but above all, your class. Now, I've said this to you before, but it bears repeating. The Duke of Sutherland is as Scottish as me, and I as Scottish as he. The Duke of Sutherland, who literally cleared thousands and thousands of Scottish people from their land to make way for sheep, and sent them, thousands of them, sailing across the Western Ocean to the United States, to Canada, to Australia, to South Africa, to New Zealand. The Duke of Buccleuch is Scottish like me. The Duke of Hamilton, Scottish like me. But that commonality of identity is trumped by my identity as a working class person and as a socialist, as an anti-fascist. The Scottish aristocracy was absolutely seeded with pro-Hitler fascists in the lifetime of some people watching this. In fact, the independence movement was seeded with pro-Hitler fascists. One of them, by the name of Arthur Donaldson, there's still an annual award at the Scottish National Party's annual conference presented by the leader, the Arthur Donaldson Award. But Arthur Donaldson was actively intriguing with Nazi agents to help facilitate a Nazi invasion of our island, in return for which he hoped he might be made the Gauleiter of Hitler's northern fastness. I'm not making any of this up. Hugh MacDiarmid, the SNP's poet, openly said that the British were a far bigger danger to Scotland than the Nazis. In fact, McDermott, for 20 years, wrote paeans of praise to Mussolini and Hitler. And during the Blitz, he wrote that as London is facing devastation from the air, I realize I hardly care. And he's their national poet for the SNP. Imagine. So what do I have in common with that kind of Scot, beyond the accident of birth, of being born on the same piece of rock? I have much more in common with the working class people in the East End of London, about which McDermott did not care that they were under devastation from the air. And as someone of Irish Catholic background, I've got to tell you that for people of Irish Catholic background, it hasn't always been a rose garden for us. As I told you a couple of weeks ago when we discussed Ireland, I was called a Fenian bastard every day of my life. And that before I realized that a Fenian bastard was really something to be. So what about that identity? William Wolfe, the former leader of the SNP, promised to stand on the border and physically repel the papal envoy who had sought to visit Scotland to discuss a visit by His Holiness the Pope. In my political lifetime. So all of my other identities scream out against a politics which reduces all of those other identities to less important than the identity of having by accident of birth been born on one piece of this island rather than another. And then there's the issue of our commonality with people like us elsewhere. Again, I said this to you in an earlier meeting. You know, Scotland is a very huge country. It's half the size of Britain. Its area is half of Britain's area. Its coastline, half of Britain's coastline. But its population is only 5 million. And until very recently, 5 million and falling. And if you take net immigration out, it is 5 million and falling. And it's very varied. You know, Glasgow has much more in common with Liverpool than it does with Inverness or Portree or Kirkcudbright. Trust me on that. Edinburgh has much more in common with Manchester than it does with even Glasgow. The interests of these two great cities and their hinterland are not the same as the interests of the Highlands and the islands and the fishing communities. And then there's the issue of Orkney and Shetland. Are they Scottish? They don't think so. And in parenthesis, that's where all the oil is. So you might get an independent Scotland with Orkney and Shetland demanding independence from you and to take your oil with them, form some kind of Nordic League, because they have far more in common with the people of the Nordic countries than they do with the people of the East End of Glasgow. Trust me on that. I think that the bus driver in Bathgate has more in common with the bus driver in Bradford than he does with the Scotsman who owns the bus. In fact, if he's working for Stagecoach, he'd be working for the same guy on both sides of the border. And how would it profit him that his boss was the same nationality as him? Because he certainly isn't of the same class. So let me move on to the frequently asked questions, ones which will be asked again after this meeting on social media. Why do you support the unity of Ireland and oppose the separation of Scotland? I put it bluntly that way because that just makes them look stupid, doesn't it? Which part of the word unity of a small island did you not understand? Which part of reuniting a country that should never have been divided and refusing to divide a country that is already united? Which part of that don't you truly, in your heart, understand? Scotland is not a colony of England. On the contrary, Scotland and England colonized much of the whole world together as part of the British Empire's Murder Incorporated. The Scottish and English Empire stretched to all four corners of the world, including Ireland. As I told you a couple of weeks ago, Scotland invaded and occupied Ireland even before Britain existed in the 17th century. Before the Union, Scotland invaded and occupied a part of Ulster and declared it her colony. And don't get me started on the role of Scottish armed forces in the suppression of the Irish people's clear and democratically expressed intention to be a united independent country. And that is the main reason why Scotland and Ireland are different. Ireland did vote for independence. Scotland has never voted for independence. Ireland was drowned in blood to punish them for voting for independence, and foremost amongst those that were shedding the blood were Scottish auxiliaries of the Black and Tans. There are no Black and Tans in Scotland, but there were many Scottish Black and Tans. Trust me on that. And right up until the end of the hopefully last phase of the war between Britain and Ireland, Scottish regiments were despised and hated on the streets of Roman Catholic areas for their role in the British occupation of Ireland. So please save yourselves the trouble of pretending that there is anything similar between the case of Scotland and the case of Ireland. Even more obscene, and I get it all the time, I hope that there's the excuse that drink has been taken, but I often get people saying to me, how come you support Palestinian independence, but you don't support Scottish? Do you really need me to make a comparison between life in Scotland under the Union and life in Palestine under the Zionist occupation? Do you really need me to do that? Suffice to say, the Palestinian people have never been given a vote ever, not ever, on whether they want to be independent. The Scottish people are given a vote every few years for nearly 100 years to decide whether or not they want to be independent. As it happens, I don't support the partition of any country anywhere. Not any country and not anywhere. So the charge that's made against me is entirely false. I want to end partition in Ireland. I want to end partition in Cyprus. I opposed the partition of Yugoslavia. I even opposed the partition of the USSR. I opposed the partition of Czechoslovakia. I'm not in favor of partitioning people who speak the same language and live together on one distinct piece of rock that is not very large. Because that doesn't seem to me like a sensible idea. If Scotland were oppressed by England, the Scottish people spoke a different language, had a different culture from England. If there was some issue of liberation here, then my attitude would, of course, be different. But there isn't any of that. You're free to choose to leave any time that you like. And as I predicted earlier, if you do have another go, the result will be the same, but worse for you, for the following reasons. The major reason why the SNP lost the last referendum was the issue of currency. Alex Salmond had no plan for what currency Scotland would use, not even the euro. He pretended he wouldn't even join the euro, although he intended to apply to join the European Union and hope that Spain or another European country with a separatist problem would not veto Scottish membership. But he wasn't going to join the euro. He was going to stick with the pound, issued by the Bank of England, the clue being in the name, the governor of which is appointed by the Treasury in Whitehall and is answerable to the British government and the British Parliament. And Alex Salmond wanted to have an independent Scotland using somebody else's currency, and that somebody else would decide the interest rates in the country, which would apply to any place using the Bank of England's money. That much became obvious to even the least informed voter in Scotland by the time they went to the polls in 2014. There were many other issues, one of which was a cloud no bigger than a man's hand at the time that I was raising it in the campaign in 2014, which turned out to be a harbinger of a very great storm to come. The prospectus of the SNP was to build an independent country largely based on Orkney and Shetland's oil, and the price of the oil in their plans was predicated at $117 per barrel. Only a couple of weeks ago, the Americans were paying people to take barrels of oil because the price had fallen so cataclysmically that they couldn't afford to store it, and were therefore not only prepared to give it away, but for a few days pay you $17 a barrel to take it off their hands. And so the idea of an independent Scotland based on oil is now utterly destroyed, as is the plan to continue to use the pound sterling. So the two principal fiscal and economic issues that dominated and would dominate again at the next referendum plan are utterly destroyed. Apart from anything else, there's only 20 years or so of oil left in the North Sea. So if Orkney and Shetland are going to make a break for independence, they really better think about doing it soon. The SNP plan is to leave a democratic union called Britain, where we elect the people who make the decisions about our country and can unelect them, in order to join a union, a European Union, where all the people speak a different language, where you'd be one of the tiniest members of that European Union, and where you would have no democratic control over decision making at all. And moreover, this time you'd have to join the euro. But you can't join the euro unless you meet the tests set by the European Central Bank for membership of the euro. And that means you must have a deficit in your budget no greater than 3.5%. Scotland's deficit right now, before the cost of separation, is at least 4 times that. Scotland is more dependent on public sector jobs and on public spending than any other part of this island. But it would not be able to continue to do so, because the independent Scottish government would have to comply with the issuing authority of the euro, whose currency you would have to use. And therefore, literally unimaginable cuts in public expenditure, in public services in Scotland would have to be carried through if membership of the euro was to be achieved. There's one last point I need to make, because it will be a major part of any new referendum. The SNP pretend that there will be no need for a border between England and Scotland, though that was somewhat undermined by their warning to people like me that if we drove to Scotland during this health emergency, we would not be allowed in. If Dominic Cummings had kept on driving past Durham and up to the Scottish border, he would not have been allowed in. So it's a funny kind of soft border that they have in mind. But of course, a soft border is a nonsense. Because if Scotland is in the European Union, that means 350 million citizens of the European Union have the right of free movement of labour to come and work in Scotland, whilst they will have no such right to do so in England and Wales. And therefore, there would be nothing, literally nothing, if there was no border, to stop half of Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Poland, the Czech Republic, all the countries that are sending their labor force abroad to other people's countries to work, there would be nothing to stop hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of free movement Eastern European labor going to Scotland and then getting on the stagecoach bus for England. So of course there will have to be a border. It'll have to be a border which is as hard a border as it's possible to be, because England will not have free movement, but Scotland will. And good luck, by the way, with persuading the Scots that it's a great idea for half of Eastern Europe to have the right to come and live and work there. That's not the Scotland I know. It's a Scotland of mythology, that Scotland is some kind of cold water Cuba. I promise you, it is not. And as Professor Sir John Curtis showed admirably in his survey of social attitudes in Scotland, the attitude towards large-scale immigration in Scotland is precisely, to the percentage point, the same in Scotland as it is in England. So I say to the separatists, bring it on. If Boris Johnson won't let you, do it yourselves. Organize a referendum. I look forward to the battle, and I'm absolutely certain that you would lose it for the reasons I have given, and I could have given many, many more. But because of the time, I should conclude there and throw the meeting open to questions. Thank you very much indeed, Dan and Rob.
Thank you very much, George. Right, we've got some questions that have come in. Let me just go to Tess, if you're happy to go on camera.
Hello, Tess.
Hi, George. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Yeah, I was just wondering what your views were on the Welsh kind of separatist question. It's gaining a lot of ground, the indie thing in Wales. I'm not sure if it's mostly around Cardiff or not so much in the rural areas. I think in the rural areas, people assume that the Welsh Assembly or Welsh Parliament are a bit rubbish. But it really seems to be gathering momentum. And do you think that there's going to be a referendum on that, perhaps? And what do you think would happen if there was?
Well, you know the situation in Wales better than I, but I'm very surprised to hear you say that support for Welsh separatism is growing in Wales. The Welsh voted to leave the European Union. The Brexit Party and UKIP did really well in Wales. The Tories now have twice the share of popular support that Labour does. And last time I looked, Plaid Cymru lost seats at the last general election, not gained them. So I'd be surprised if there was much appetite in Wales for independence. And I think all the arguments I make against separatism for Scotland can actually be made even more strongly in regard to Wales. Wales has the language, of course, which in Scotland, apart from very small numbers indeed, God bless them, in the Highlands and in the Islands and in a small part of my Glasgow constituency in Partick, hardly anyone speaks Gaelic, and far more people speak Punjabi and Polish. Gaelic would probably be the fourth language in the country, although quite a lot of money is spent by the Scottish government on promoting the language, but not with great success. And you can see why, because we have a language. It's quite a useful one. The English language is probably the dominant language in the world, certainly on the internet and in aviation and science and so on. Why would we search for an alternative to it? That would be reinventing the wheel, I think. But obviously there is the language question in Wales. But in South Wales, that too is not as a big an issue as it is in the north. And Wales is much more Anglified than Scotland is. There are far more English people, percentage-wise, living in Wales than living in Scotland, I think. The Union flag is much more popular in Wales than it is in Scotland. You don't see many people in Scotland using it, but you do see that in Wales, particularly in South Wales. And the whole Brexit issue ties into that. So I'd be surprised. Maybe we should have a discussion at a later date on the issue of Wales, but I'm probably not the best person to lead that.
Okay, thank you very much. We've now got a question from Tom. I'll just unmute you, Tom.
Hello.
Hi, Tom.
Hi, George. You're right. Yeah,
Good.
my question about at the moment, obviously, with the ongoing stuff in Hong Kong and how they're using their kind of pro-democracy movement, which has obviously been hijacked by like fascist elements and by foreign elements as well, such as foreign intelligence sources and stuff like that. But they are using it's a democracy protest, and they're using it as like a kind of, well, we're just like Scotland, we're just like all other kind of countries, but how can we kind of counter that view when it's clearly being used not so much as a genuine anti-imperialist kind of stance, but more so like a pro-separation into a kind of becoming a sphere of influence for the USA kind of thing over there. Obviously, they are using.
You know, you can't apply that to Scotland because there already is democracy in Scotland, and there was a referendum that was supposed to be a once-in-a-lifetime referendum. It turned out not to be the lifetime of a hamster before they were demanding another one. I take the view that Scotland has the right to have a referendum anytime that it chooses. It can have one every year if it chooses, although of course the outcome would be subject to the law of diminishing returns. But nobody could credibly say that Scotland is being denied anything. They had a referendum and they lost it. And our position as a party, I hope, certainly my position, is that they can have another one if they like. Nobody can stop them. It's if they have the national right of self-determination, they're entitled to test the water on that anytime that they like. So there are no black and tans in Scotland. There are no tanks. There are no security crackdowns or any of that. As a matter of fact, the SNP have turned out to be a pretty ruthless one-party state themselves, helped by the utterly pitiful excuse for a Labour Party that now exists in Scotland. If you think the Labour Party in England is bad, where do you see the Scottish Labour Party?
Thank you, George. I have a question to read out here from Mark on the subject of the SNP.
Yeah.
Mark says, George, what are your thoughts on the SNP wishing to keep the British monarch as their head of state? Surely this proves they are much closer to being tartan Tories than left-wing.
Yes, I mean, there are all kinds of contradictions. They wanted to keep not just the monarch, but her pound with her face on it, even though that would mean that all fiscal decisions would be made by a foreign country and that they would have to live with those decisions. But the SNP doesn't only want to join the European Union, it wants to remain in NATO. It claims it wants rid of nuclear weapons, but it wants to join NATO, which is, of course, a nuclear armed military alliance. How's that for hypocrisy? Get the nuclear weapons off our soil but protect us with your nuclear weapons on somebody else's soil. This comes from a period in time in which the SNP were really tartan Tories when I started fighting them. I mean, they were literally tartan Tories. Since then, they have learned how to talk left and act right. Since then, they have won over certain other sections of the community and therefore had to tone down their royalism, their Protestantism, and so on. Although I happen to believe that if you scratched it, it's still there underneath. But I might be wrong about that. I might be doing them an injustice. I just don't like them. I know them well enough, not just the ones I fought on the streets of Dundee and the streets of Glasgow, but the ones that I saw rollicking along the corridors of Westminster, because for the SNP MPs, it's always been the case that every night was Burns night. And from what I gather, that hasn't changed.
Thank you, George. I have one more question here to read out from David. He asks, if Scotland is known as a nation country, why is its independence from Britain an important matter for us in the Workers' Party?
Well, it has the right to independence, as I said, but it also has the right not to exercise its right to independence. That's what self-determination means. Self-determination doesn't mean you have to be independent. In the Workers' Party, we would have argued that whilst the Bosnians might have had a national right to secede from Yugoslavia, they ought not to do so. That whilst Georgia had the right to secede from the USSR, it ought not to do so. Self-determination has two or even three options. You can either stay in the relation that you were in, you can leave it entirely, or you could find a halfway house, neither leaving it nor staying as you were. But at least Yugoslavia was not partitioning one island, was not partitioning one island with 66 million people on it who all speak the same language, have the same culture, listen to the same music, watch the same television, movies, newspapers, magazines, books. What's the argument for breaking up that stable, historically constituted community of people? How does that take us forward in any way? So, as I said earlier, I repeat it. On the level of theory, on the level of principle, Scotland has the right to leave, and if it did, we would accept that and do our best to make it succeed. But we have a duty, if we think it's a bad thing to do, to tell the workers in Scotland that that's what we think.
Thank you, George. Okay, I'm going to unmute CJ, who has another question for you here.
All right, George.
Hi, CJ.
All right, yeah, it's just a question on Catalan and Basque independence. Just sort of, you know, try and get your views on what you think. I mean, with the Basque country, it's kind of calmed down a little bit over the last 20 years or so. And what your views are on why you think that's kind of calmed down a little bit, or whether you think it might sort of gather momentum again, and what the differences are or similarities are with Scotland, if any.
Well, this is not the Workers' Party speaking. This is me speaking personally. We have never discussed these two questions. So what I'm about to say is entirely my personal opinion. I could never support the secession of one part of a country which was driven by the wish of that part of the country to be free of the poorer parts of the country which they think are holding them back. That's why I could never support independence for the north of Italy when the Northern League were fighting for that. Now that they are just the League, they are not quite, because they're in government. But I couldn't support separatism for the north of Italy because that was based on the north of Italy, already the richest part of Italy, becoming even richer, while the south of Italy, already the poorest part of Italy, becoming even poorer. I cannot support separatism for the Catalans to get rid of the poor. I won't use the word that some of them use to describe the poor Spaniards in the south of their country. And ditto the Basques. Now, in the Basque country, it's more complex because Basque language and culture is hegemonic in the Basque country. It actually is not amongst Catalans. And that's why the relative support for separatism in the two places is different. For example, the city of Barcelona, which everyone associates automatically with Catalan nationalism, the city of Barcelona voted against separatism. And the city of Barcelona has a lot of people who live in it who are not Catalans and don't speak the Catalan language and share their culture with the rest of Spain and indeed with the rest of Europe. Of course, I don't support the way in which the right-wing government in Madrid handled these national demands in Catalonia and in the Basque country. But now that the right wing are out of power, and there are people like us, quite a few of them actually, in the Spanish parliament, what would our attitude be? And what would we say to them if we met them? Should we say you should break up your country, make it poorer, allow the two richest parts of your country to leave, even though you have a constitution which doesn't allow any part of the country to leave, and that constitution was voted on in a referendum in which, in the case of Catalonia, the majority in Catalonia voted for that constitution. So this is not an easy issue. Now, I know that there's a lot of people like to fly the Catalan flag. They imagine that if you love Barcelona as a football team, you need to support Catalan independence and so on. That's actually not at all true. But in the end, the people of Spain are going to have to resolve this matter. It's not for us to prescribe to them, to give lectures to them. But don't ask me to support Catalan separatism, Basque separatism, because I will not do so.
Very well.
For the same reason I didn't want Yugoslavia to break up.
Thank you, George. I have another question from Peter here, who would like to ask your advice on the matter.
Good evening, George from Belfast.
Hi, Peter. Hi.
Hi there. So I, as always, can see the reason in what you're saying. So what I'm really looking for is some personal advice, really. I'm half Scottish myself. My father's family hail from Airdrie. I have many close friends across Scotland, all of whom, without exception, are left-wing pro-independence. A certain degree of unspoken reciprocal solidarity has been expected between me and them for the Irish cause and myself for their Scottish cause. So what I'm really looking to hear from you is, do you have any advice for someone who's about to become very unpopular taking this kind of line?
Well, the first thing I'd need to say is this is a very, very new thing. The support for Scottish independence amongst the type of Scottish people that you are describing was close to zero only 20 years ago. I remember asking one now active Scottish nationalist, then very active Irish nationalist of some importance in my political life, do you know what the Scotland score was today? And he said, well, who gives a toss about the Scotland score? The Irish people in Scotland, like me, had a very different attitude towards Scotland because of our life's experience and our parents' and grandparents' experience. And therefore, the SNP had virtually no support amongst our community for the reasons that I spoke of earlier. So this is, first of all, very, very new in political terms. It's no more than 20 years old. It may even be a little bit less. Scotland is not Ireland. The Scots are not being occupied. The Scots did not vote for independence and it was drowned in blood. The Irish did vote for independence and it was drowned in blood, not least by Scottish people. The tartan along the bottom of the bell bottoms in East Belfast, Google it. It's not hard to find. The tartan on the hats of the soldiers shooting down Irish people. Google it. It's really not hard to find. So I would find no difficulty myself in arguing the case that I'm arguing, but I'm not there. So I can only wish you well. The best rubric is, why would I support the end of partition in Ireland only to institute partition in Britain? What would be the logic of that? Why would I support Irish unification and British disunification? What would be the logic of that? That's how I'd put it.
Thank you, George. Right, we have another few more questions come through here. John, I'm going to unmute John to ask his question.
Hi, George.
Hi there.
Are you right?
Good to see you.
Yeah, no, and you. So if we look at 2010, the Labour Party got 1 million votes. In 2015, it got 707,000. Sorry, yeah, in 2015, it's 707,000. In 2017, it got 717,000. And then in 2019, it collapsed to 511,000. Indeed, 2017 kind of painted by some in the Labour Party as a victory for the Labour Party. It got less votes than the Tories in Scotland. Labour got 717,000, as I mentioned, and the Tories got 757,000. How responsible is the Labour Party in the kind of the current system, the current kind of goings on in Scotland? And how can we change that for ourselves?
And those figures you've given were when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party. Imagine what Keir Starmer's going to poll. Keir Starmer and Richard Leonard, he's definitely no Lenin, together would send anyone in the land to sleep. You could play their voices on your children's bedside recorders to send your children to sleep. The idea that the Labour Party is going to recover with Keir Starmer as their leader is absolutely fanciful. Labour is now, got worse, by the way. Labour is now the third party in Scotland, and in recent polls has been polling less than 15% of the electorate. The Conservatives may benefit further from the presumed disappearance of the Brexit party. And don't forget, more people voted for Brexit in Scotland at the 2016 referendum than voted for the SNP. Something often overlooked when Scotland is painted as a Euro fanatic country. And the Brexit party and even UKIP have done quite well in Scottish elections. Now, the Conservatives are likely to benefit most from the virtual disappearance, one presumes, of both of these parties. So Labour will be a very distant third and would have no seats at all in the Scottish Parliament next year, but for the system of proportional representation, which we hope to take advantage of ourselves, because everybody gets 2 votes. You vote for your MP in your constituency, but you have a second vote that you vote for your party of choice. And that doesn't have to be the same party as you voted for in the MP election. And by a peculiar, I'll not go into all the details, it's called the additional member system. You get a proportion of the parliament who are not elected in any constituency, but are elected proportionately from a party list system. And we haven't formally decided yet, but I'll be arguing for the Workers' Party to stand so that the Scottish working class has a decent socialist alternative to vote for. And I think we might do surprisingly well in some areas at least.
Thank you, George. I've got another question that I'm going to read out to you now from Ben. He has 3 questions wrapped in one, essentially. Firstly, he asks, would a socialist Scotland with its own currency be economically viable? And then, if a socialist independent Scotland were viable, is there any chance that socialism would be more likely in an independent Scotland than in the entire of Great Britain?
What was it Bob Crow said? Do I need to say it again? If my auntie had balls, she'd be my uncle. None of these things is remotely practicable and is so hypothetical that I'd probably waste a lot of time answering it and to the exclusion of other questions. Would a 5 million strong independent Scotland outside of the EU be economically viable? No, but I'd be prepared to go back and try and make it Cuba. But there's no Soviet Union to bankroll us and subsidize us. And there's no wish in Scotland yet for Scotland to be like Cuba. And anyone who imagines that there is has never lived there. And if they have lived there, they haven't got out enough. But in theory, of course, an independent country free from international interference of 5 million people, in theory, is possible. But it would have to be a proper socialist country. It would not be economically viable as a capitalist country. That should be obvious. Outside of the EU, outside of Great Britain, how could it be? How could it exist outside of those 2 orbits? And how could it have its own currency? Currency backed by what? Currency guaranteed by whom? That would not be remotely practicable. If an independent Scotland outside of the EU and not socialist, with a command economy, with the support of the Scottish people, if not that, then it would fall. It would collapse.
Thank you, George. I have Christina with a contribution here. I'm going to unmute you, Christina.
George, thank you for
Hi.
the tremendous class analysis. It's people forget class analysis in debates like this, in ideas like that. And I will tell you, there is a person who would be very sad by listening to your analysis. And he is the former president of the European Council, Donald Tusk, who proclaims, self-identifies as a Scot. You see, it's nothing to do with national identity, but everything
Is it to do with him being Donald? Because
Yeah.
Donald Trump does the same. Donald Tusk and Donald Trump, my God, Donald, where's your trousers?
It's interesting. So nothing to do with national identity, everything to do with finding ways of fragmenting the working class, right? And I cannot see any sane member of the working class in Scotland who would like to go back to common fishery policies, who want to go back to, without even the protection that the UK had, the VAT exemptions, you know, they will never have that. It's suicidal. And let's not forget that to enter the casino that is European Union, you need to have, in theory, a deficit that is less than 3%. And from what we read, Scotland has more than 7.5 deficit. So imagine the kind of books that they will cook, the way they cooked, you know, Greek spreadsheets. I mean, it can only be suicide for the working class of Scotland. And this divide and rule policy is what comes from Brussels. It is what comes from the imperialism that we fight in all fronts, including European Union's imperialism. This is what people need to be very clear about. When you talk about Palestine, when you talk about Ireland, and when we talk about Scotland, which are the ruling classes that will benefit from this fragmentation, from this little flag waving that fragments the working class? We can dream about what the working class, how we would unite in creating a different Britain, a different union not based on imperialism. But for that to happen, the Scottish working class should never be on the claws of people like Donald Tusk and the claws of European imperialism.
Bravo.
So yes.
I think that's said it very powerfully, Rob. I would only add this. If Scotland were in the European Union, it would be literally a small dot on the European Union's landscape. A small dot economically, a small dot politically. It would be used, I've no doubt, by some as a ramp against Britain that had withdrawn from the European Union, but that would not last for very long. Scotland would be ruthlessly dealt with in terms of its deficit, which is, by the way, 12%, and the fiscal rules would not be relaxed in Scotland's favor. How could they be? Because if they were relaxed in Scotland's favor, they'd have to be relaxed in favor of many other small countries in the European Union. The countries they insultingly refer to as the periphery. Well, nothing would be more peripheral to the European Union bosses than a small country of 5 million in the northern half of what used to be Britain. I'm absolutely sure of that.
Thank you, George. We've got a few more questions and a little bit more time. I'm going to read one out we've got from Gavin. He says, Scotland rely on the Barnett formula for funding. If they became independent, what would they do financially?
Well, the Barnett formula, I used to take my tea with Mr. Barnett, later Lord Barnett, for many years, actually. He sought my company out because I was forever talking about the Barnett formula, and he came up one day and said, I should introduce myself to you. My name is Barnett Formula. And I got on very well with him and discussed it many, many times. Scotland has a considerable advantage over any other part of the country when it comes to the public expenditure settlement. Partly because there was and is a great poverty in Scotland, and obviously the poorer you are, the more public expenditure you have a right to receive. Partly because our territory is so vast, yet so sparsely populated. So many communities are so isolated, one from the other, and all from the center, and the difficulty of delivering public services across such a big country, such a widespread population, and so on. But of course, if Scotland left Britain, the Barnett formula no longer exists. And so that amount, that advantage, which is around about £1,000 per head per year, that advantage completely disappears and instantly. Then Scotland would have to take its share of our national debt, which, whatever it was in 2014, it's a lot more now. And if this crisis is as bad as is predicted, it's going to be a lot more yet. And Scotland will have to shoulder its share of that national debt burden. There would be, in my opinion, a significant shift of economic activity and even population from Scotland to England in the event of a breakaway. There would also be some people would move from England to Scotland because they'd quite like to live in a new country. But the net result would be bad for Scotland. Our population would fall until the East European immigrants came. Once we had been admitted to the European Union, if we were to be so admitted. But a lot of companies would relocate. It's one thing staying in Britain outside the EU. It's another thing being in Scotland outside of the EU and outside of Britain. And on any test, Scotland would be outside of the EU for a period of some years of negotiation and adjustment to the Euro's rules. And so I think a significant number of companies would relocate outside of Scotland. Scotland's domestic market is extremely small by definition. It's small and weak because there's not many of us, and a lot of us are really poor and therefore have very little spending money. And so the domestic market in Scotland is poor. And to withdraw from Britain would not be something that many of these companies would be prepared to do. Imagine, if you will, that Scotland had been an independent country in 2008, when the banking crash was led by Scottish banks. The Bank of Scotland, the Royal Bank of Scotland, all would have gone bust. And they would have gone bust, and there would have been nobody to bail them out, and nobody in Scotland, frankly, would have wanted to bail them out. But the reality is the Scottish economy would have been destroyed in 2008 if Scotland had been an independent country at that time. And then there's the coronavirus, Rob. Does that not, more than anything else, negate the idea of a border? Can you really have in one island two sets of health policies? Can you have two sets of quarantines, two sets of lockdowns? I can drive to Northumberland, but I can't drive to Scotland, and so on. It makes the case, I think, both on the economic and all other levels, that it's better for the working class people in this island to stay together.
Thank you, George. We have one more question. Darren, I think, is willing to go on camera. I'll just unmute you, Darren.
Hello, George. London speaking
Hi,
here. Hello again. Simple question, just to turn things on the heads a little bit. It's a bit bizarre. You got Parliament in Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, but not England. So, and should England have its own Parliament? And also, would this then dilute the Scottish influence in the existing House of Parliament? So, what are your thoughts?
Well, there is already an English Parliament. It's called Westminster. It's in England. And it already is the case now that Scottish and Welsh and MPs from the north of Ireland are not allowed to vote on explicitly English matters. That was not always the case. Under Tony Blair, I remember well, haranguing Scottish Labour MPs going into the voting lobby to vote to bring in tuition fees for students in England, even though they did not apply in Scotland. That was a grotesque misuse of parliamentary power, because at that time, Scotland had a lot of Labour MPs, one of whom was me. Now you can't do that. If a matter applies only to England and Wales, which most of them do, England and Wales legislation, only English and Welsh MPs can vote on them. And that seems to me to be an English Parliament as close as, damn it. The idea that we should build yet another Parliament and fill it with yet more freeloading MPs is not one you'll persuade many English people of, I think. Thanks, Darren.
Thanks very much, George. One more contribution from Fran. Where are you, Fran? I'll unmute you.
All right. I just wanted to say, how do we, like, as socialists, like, undo the lies that the bourgeois have put on national determination and stuff like that? Like, we as a party are not against self-determination for workers. That is literally our thing. How do we convince them that socialism is the answer and not some sort of like bourgeois idea of independence first? Because in my opinion, that makes things harder.
Definitely. The idea that an independent Scotland in the European Union could have anything to do with socialism is obviously completely fanciful. The European Union outlaws socialism. That's why we fought to leave it. It makes socialism literally impossible, illegal. And that's why we fought to leave it. So if Scotland leaves this union to join the other union, you can kiss any idea of a socialist Scotland goodbye. But if we stay together outside of the European Union, we have the possibility one day of building socialism on this island. And Of course, that seems like a long way away. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I'm not a soothsayer, but I prefer to take my chances with something that, if I can persuade my fellow countrymen and women of, I can implement and can achieve, to a situation that, regardless of whether every person in the land wanted socialism, they could not have it, because the rules and all the pillars of the European Union make that impossible. Of course, we're not on the verge of socialism in this island. We don't know how far away from it we are, but we're definitely not close to it. So what we must do is the right thing by the working people at this point in our lives and in our history. And I'm absolutely clear that the right thing to do at this time is to keep the working class of this island together and to turn away from the divisive and ultimately destructive ideas of nationalism. Because just ponder this: if you got an independent Scotland and it all started going badly, that Scotland filled up with, let's be realistic, 300,000 or 400,000 Eastern European refugees who really wanted to come to England but could no longer do so, and turned up in Greenock instead. That the living standards of the Scottish people were being shredded by the European Central Bank's demands for fiscal responsibility and the tiny budget deficits that they permit, unless you're France. If that happened, life for millions of Scottish people would become dramatically worse. And what would the likely outcome of that be? The likely outcome of that would be only negative, in my view. You'd have some people blaming the immigrants, other people blaming the English, and the political situation would enter a vortex, a downward spiral that could become very ugly indeed. So turn away from it, I say.
Thanks very much, George. I think we've come to the end of our meeting for the evening. But yeah, some great points raised there, brilliant contributions from people. Just on that point there of the, the onward journey, struggle towards socialism. Yeah, it's not something that we immediately tell people that we achieve, but like they say, a job begun is a job half done. So I hope that people that have been watching online get involved. You can sign up via the website. And for our members, some of whom have been participating tonight, remember that we have meeting on Wednesday night, and we will have our next public meeting next Tuesday. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, George.
Thank you very much. Good night, all.
Good night, all.